Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. May I have your attention, please? Okay. Okay, good evening. Can everybody hear me? Yep, thank you. It is my great pleasure to welcome a very special guest today, Mrs. Victoria Yeager, wife of General Chuck Yeager, the first man to break the sound barrier. And we are going to play a short video documenting the general's life and achievements. And then my co-host will introduce Victoria in more detail. And then it will be her part, Victoria's part, to answer your questions and tell everything which is needed to be told. Okay. Okay, so without further ado,
the man, the mission, the legacy. General Chuck Yeager is internationally known for both his achievements as an aviator and for the character that made them possible. The General Chuck Yeager The man, the mission, the legacy. General Chuck Yeager is internationally known for both his achievements as an aviator and for the character that made them possible. The General Chuck Yeager Foundation promotes the core values that have guided his remarkable life and helps others to conquer their personal barriers. Visit his foundation online at chuckyeager.com to learn how you can participate in the General's latest and most personal mission.
He is to aviation what Mark Twain was to literature. There's something unmistakably, indeed quintessentially American about him.
I just happened to be at the right place at the right time and at the right age but I had the capability of taking advantage of it.
A native of West Virginia, 18-year-old Charles E. Chuck Yeager enlisted in the Army Air Corps in September 1941. After serving as an airplane mechanic and crew chief, he entered pilot training in September of 1942. 6 months later, he graduated as an enlisted flight officer assigned to the 357th Fighter Group. Flying a P-51 Mustang with the 363rd Fighter Squadron, he entered combat in February of 1944. He scored his first aerial victory during his 7th mission on March 4th. The next day, he was shot down over southern France. Displaying the grit and resourcefulness for which he'd become legendary, Yeager managed to evade capture, and even more remarkably, to convince General Dwight D. Eisenhower to let him return to combat with his squadron. The skies above Western Europe were definitely the right place for an eagle-eyed, aggressive young fighter pilot in late 1944. On a single mission in October, for example, he claimed 5 Me-109s, and he ultimately scored a total of 13 victories over his Luftwaffe counterparts. German fighters weren't the only threat he and his fellow fighter pilots faced. Rolling over into steep dives, they found themselves at speeds of 500 miles per hour, about 75% of the speed of sound, and into the unknown region of transonic flight, where the effects of compressibility, loss of control, and structurally devastating aerodynamic loads began to take over, with sometimes deadly consequences. Aerodynamicists knew that as an airplane entered the transonic region, the region between 0.7 and 1.3 Mach, it was entering an area of unpredictable airflow conditions which caused shock waves, which drastically altered an airplane's controllability. Furthermore, many of them theorized that as an airplane approached the speed of sound, or Mach 1, a virtual wall of air would build up in front of it, which would be impenetrable. During the war years, the possibility of actually slamming into the so-called sound barrier had become much more real as the result of a revolutionary technological development. In October 1942, at an out-of-the-way place called Muroc on California's high desert, the XP-59A, America's first jet, had taken to the skies for its maiden flight. With the development of the turbojet, it became apparent that the means would soon be at hand to propel an airplane through the transonic and even perhaps into the supersonic region. The urgent question was, could a piloted airplane survive in it? Now, Captain Chuck Yeager was unconcerned about such matters when he returned stateside in January of 1945. Assigned to Perrin Field, Texas as a flight instructor, he might never have been heard from again if not for a fateful decision. As an evadee, he was given his choice of bases, and for no other reason than that it was the closest base to his hometown of Hamlin, West Virginia, he chose Wright Field in Ohio. Arriving there as a maintenance officer in July 1945, Chuck Yeager once again found himself in the right place at the right time. Wright Field was at the hub of Air Force research and development activities, including flight test. Colonel Albert Boyd was chief of the flight test division. Tough and absolutely unyielding in his demand for excellence, he's been called the father of modern Air Force flight testing. Under his stern glare, only the very best pilots were admitted into the division. He watched Yeager perform in a number of air shows, was impressed by his flying skills and attitude, and in early 1946, Yeager was transferred to fighter ops in the flight test division. In the meantime, under the auspices of the Air Force and the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA, an experimental rocket plane, the Bell X-1, had been built to explore the transonic flight regime. It was powered by a 4-chamber, 6,000-pound thrust engine, and in sobering tribute to just how little the designers knew about the transonic region, its structure had been stressed to withstand 18 Gs. The Bell Aircraft Corporation proved its airworthiness up to a speed of 0.8 Mach during a series of flights at Muroc between December 1946 and June 1947. The main question throughout this period, however, concerned who was going to make the assault on Mach 1. Normally, Bell or the NACA would have been tabbed for such a risky research program. But in this instance, and for the very first time, the Air Force opted to take it on. And when asked if one of his pilots could do it, Colonel Boyd's enthusiastic reply was, "You bet." Eager to prove that one of his military pilots could successfully conduct a highly experimental research program, he was faced with one of the most important and difficult decisions of his career, deciding who would fly the airplane. From a list of more than 100 pilots, he winnowed out all but the very best, and then repeated the process again and again. It came as a surprise when he finally chose Yeager, a very junior test pilot. But Boyd considered him the best instinctive pilot he'd ever seen, and he demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to remain cool and disciplined under pressure. Yeager has always attributed this to his combat experience.
The one advantage that I had probably in doing research flying was I had been very disciplined in combat, meaning if you have no control over the outcome, forget it. Duty is paramount. That's, you got duty to do, you fly. And when you fly combat, you know that a lot of people are going to get killed. You just hope, since you have no control over it, and if you get killed, you don't know anything about it anyway, so you wipe it out of your mind, and you're able to ignore it completely and concentrate on what you're doing. So it was real easy for me to transition into research flying and test work because I could concentrate on what I was doing probably without worrying about the outcome.
After undergoing training on the X-1 and all of its systems at Muroc, he went up for his first unpowered flight on 6 August. And to everyone's surprise, almost immediately after dropping away from the B-29, he nonchalantly performed a series of slow rolls.
Well, that's a fighter pilot. That, to me, that's where I was trained. And upside down and right side up, it doesn't make any difference to a fighter pilot. That's where you live, And I just wanted to see what the airplane rolled like. It was beautiful. God, what a neat airplane to fly.
On 29 August, he completed his first powered flight and extended the envelope to 0.85 Mach. On his next flight, he took it all the way out to 0.89 Mach, where he began to encounter buffeting and a nose-down trim change. 2 flights later, at 0.9 Mach, the X-1 began to nose up, and the buffeting became severe. He was now flying in a region where no man had flown before. And as he increased his speed on subsequent flights, the trim reversals had NACA engineers worried that the X-1 would depart from controlled flight. Yeager, however, remained confident.
It's hard to explain to people how you can have confidence or faith in a piece of machinery, but when you work with it and you have a feel for machinery, I had it like the X-1. I knew the airplane intimately, and I figured it wouldn't, bite me without giving me some sort of warning.
That warning came when, during his 8th powered flight on 10 October, he pulled back on the stick and nothing happened. Post-flight analysis revealed that a shock wave had formed along the hinge line of the elevator, causing it to lose its effectiveness. He'd flown to the very edge of the sound barrier that morning, but it appeared that as he approached Mach 1, he'd lose control of the airplane. Then, Captain Jack Ridley, his flight test engineer, suggested an alternative.
Ridley's guy figured out, we've got a capability of moving the horizontal stabilizer, and if we can get this thing to working, we'd never used it before, and if you think you're good enough to fly it with a crude method like this trimmable horizontal stabilizer, he said, I think you can control this airplane through Mach 1.
He was tantalizingly close to that goal, and thus, as the B-29 lifted off from the runway on the morning of October 14th, there was an air of keen anticipation, tinged with apprehension. This could be the flight. But would Yeager actually be able to control the X-1 by making adjustments to the movable tail? And was there a wall at Mach 1? At 7,000 feet, he made his way down to the X-1's hatch, and suffering from broken ribs sustained in a riding accident, painfully crawled into the cockpit. Launch occurred at 20,000 feet. As the X-1 fell away, Yeager ignited all 4 rocket chambers in rapid sequence and began to climb. He tested the movable stabilizer and found it to be effective. From 0.88 to 0.97 Mach, he once again encountered all of the buffeting, instability, and other phenomena which had by then become so familiar. And then, at 43,000 feet, the needle on his Mach meter jumped off the scale. He had just crossed the invisible threshold to flight faster than sound.
A lot of people ask you, what were your feelings on that particular day at that time? I think my feeling was that this program is finished. I can get on with the rest of them. It was one of many, and it didn't mean anything as people said later on in life. I didn't realize what it meant to the Air Force. All I know is that I had a feeling of accomplishment. I'd done what the old man sent us out to do. So.
Though few people, including Yeager, could fully comprehend its implications at the time, his flight that morning was the first step in a chain of events that would ultimately vault man beyond the atmosphere and into space. In an age enchanted by speed, he was the fastest man alive and the recipient of the most prestigious honors in aviation. The citation accompanying the Collier Trophy most aptly summarized the magnitude of his flight, calling it the greatest since the first successful flight of the original Wright brothers airplane. Yeager had entered a time in his life he'd later recall as his golden age of flying and fun. It was an age when Muroc became better known to the world as Edwards Air Force Base. A place where the limits of time, space, and the imagination were being dramatically expanded. A place where a whole stable of exotic research airplanes were probing the unknowns of flight in an effort to solve their mysteries. And where new experimental prototypes appeared on the flight line in seemingly endless numbers. And he was in the middle of it, flying as many as 27 different types and models of aircraft in a single month, and loving every minute of it. He demonstrated an unrivaled ability to ferret out and understand an airplane's flaws, and flying constantly at the edge of the envelope and then beyond. He also demonstrated an uncanny ability to coolly think his way through potentially catastrophic situations, take appropriate action, and bring his ship back. These skills were never more in evidence than during an epic flight in late 1953. The test pilots at Edwards were a notoriously competitive breed. Now, the Skyrocket program was a combined NACA and Navy effort. Not unduly fond of either, and certainly not about to be outdone, Yeager took the Air Force's Bell X-1A up for an assault on Crossfield's Mark just 3 weeks later. He easily shattered his rival's record that day, flying all the way out to Mach 2.44, more than 1,600 miles per hour. His record ride proved, however, that there were still many mysteries in supersonic flight. Shortly after leveling out at 74,000 feet, the X-1A began to roll slowly to the left. As Yeager corrected for this, it suddenly rolled sharply to the right. Another correction, and it snapped to the left and tumbled violently out of control. He was encountering something new, something called inertia coupling. The airplane was literally tumbling about all three of its axes. The Sierras flashing across his vision. He took a severe beating in the cockpit as the wildly snapping, spinning, and rolling airplane plummeted 50,000 feet before Yeager, barely conscious after cracking his head on the canopy, somehow managed to recover to level flight and save himself and the ship to fly another day. Calling it the fastest and wildest airplane ride in history, even Crossfield had to admit that it was probably fortunate that Yeager was in the cockpit on that flight. And for the consummate skill he displayed on this flight, President Eisenhower presented him with the Harmon International Trophy in ceremonies at the White House. Just 2 months after his wild ride in the X-1A, Yeager found himself in Okinawa with General Boyd, about to enter what he's called the most demanding test program he ever faced. He was assigned to fly the first captured MiG-15 and to try to fly it higher and faster than any Russian pilot had ever dared. In wretched weather, he was supposed to ring out what he called a flying booby trap, an unforgiving craft susceptible to unexpected pitch-ups, fatal spins, and a host of other critical problems. And ring it out, he did, taking it up over 55,000 feet, and then, despite the fact that he knew he'd lose elevator control, putting it into a near vertical dive to achieve a top speed of 0.98 Mach. General Boyd was later to write that the flight tests of the Russian MiG really demonstrated what Chuck Yeager was made of. Because of him, we now know more about this airplane than the Russians do. Yeager has called these flights his swan song as a test pilot. The year was 1954, and he spent the remainder of the decade commanding tactical squadrons. First in Germany, where he led the 417th Fighter Bomber Squadron to top honors in all of the Air Force's European gunnery meets. And then, returning to California's high desert at George Air Force Base, where as commander of the 1st Tactical Fighter Squadron, he planned and led the first flawless transatlantic fighter deployment in tactical air command history. In 1961, he returned to Edwards, where, the following year, he took over as commandant of the new U.S. Air Force Aerospace Research Pilot School, or ARPS, a unique, one-of-a-kind institution designed to prepare the nation's best and brightest military test pilots for a new frontier, spaceflight. Nearly 40 ARPS graduates would be selected for the space program, and 26 would become astronauts in the Gemini, Apollo, and Space Shuttle programs. Part of their training involved flights in one of the school's NF-104s. These modified starfighters were reconfigured with rocket boosters and reaction control jets, which permitted students to zoom up above 100,000 feet and experience some of the sensations of flight in space. It was in one of these craft that Chuck Yeager had one of his closest calls. In December of 1963, in preparation for an assault on the world altitude record, he blasted upward at a speed of Mach 2. As he went over the top at 104,000 feet, he was unable to bring the nose down, and the 104 fell off flat and went into a spin. After struggling with the plummeting airplane for more than 90,000 feet, doing everything he could to bring it out of its deadly flat spin, he finally punched out. As his chute popped open, one of the rocket thrusters on the ejection seat shattered the faceplate on his helmet, and with propellant residue still burning, ignited the pure oxygen inside his pressure suit. Though seriously injured, he recovered to flight status, and during the ensuing accident investigation, he amazed the investigators when his precise recall of every motion of the airplane and each of the readings from his gauges was confirmed by data from trackers and onboard recorders. Despite all of his legendary achievements in flight test, combat always remained the ultimate flying experience for Chuck Yeager. And in 1966, he finally returned to it when he took over command of the 405th Fighter Wing. Commanding 5 squadrons, flying 3 different types of airplanes scattered across Southeast Asia, he made it a point to regularly fly missions with each of them. And in the process, he added another 127 sorties to his combat record. Returning stateside in 1968, he took over the 4th Tactical Fighter Wing at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, North Carolina, and successfully led it on a major deployment when the Pueblo crisis erupted in Korea. The wing was cited for its first Air Force Outstanding Unit Award. Yeager had entered the Air Corps back in 1941 as a buck private. In 1969, he was promoted to the rank of Brigadier General. After tours as the Vice Commander of the 17th Air Force in Germany and as U.S. Defense Representative to Pakistan, he spent the final years of his active duty career as Director of the Air Force Inspection and Safety Center at Norton Air Force Base. Fittingly, he returned to Edwards for his last active duty flight in February of 1975.
You've flown everything in the Air Force inventory. Today was your last flight. What kind of thoughts did you have today coming up here?
It's really, it's fun, but it's also a job. It's something that gets in your blood because of the different kinds of airplanes I've flown all over the world. You still get a thrill out of flying any kind of an airplane, really.
3 days later, after 34 years of service and nearly 11,000 hours in the cockpits of some 180 different types of military aircraft, his distinguished military career came to a close in ceremonies at Norton. For Yeager, however, retirement from active duty
Glennis,
meant
his
anything
first
but
wife.
retirement from active life.
And Jackie
There were
Cochran.
endless requests for interviews and public appearances,
Walter Cronkite.
public service messages on television, a special peacetime Congressional Medal of Honor, a major motion picture, The Right Stuff, which dramatized some of the major events in his life, and a best-selling autobiography which provided more of the real stuff of history. Yeager had never been one to live in the past, however, and he continued to serve the Air Force, NASA, and the aerospace industry He's a much sought-after advisor on issues ranging from the development of new, state-of-the-art systems to the safety of spaceflight operations. Perhaps most remarkable of all, he remained an active consulting test pilot at Edwards, serving, in the words of one commander, as a wise, accurate, and keenly observant advisor to the Air Force Flight Test Center.
And hell, I get up there 35, 40,000 feet, smoke out the Mach 2, and look around to Mount Charleston, to the Pacific, to Baja, California, to the High Sierra, and say, I own it all.
In October of 1997, he returned to Edwards one last time to commemorate the 50th anniversary of his epic flight in the X-1.
Roger, I'm turning in right now, Joe. Just running 9798. I'm 43 miles where you're standing. And we just went to Mach 1.
And to call it a career after piloting high-performance fighters for more than 55 years.
I've flown with the best test pilots in the world. All the guys who were up there with me today in the 15s and 16s are really dedicated, skilled test pilots. And it's been a pleasure flying with those guys because they keep me out of trouble. And I have one final word to say, and what I can say is that what I am, I owe to the Air Force. Thank you.
Former President George Bush summed up the feelings of many people that day when he wrote, "If I was asked to choose one word that would define Chuck Yeager, it would be service. Fighter pilot, test pilot, combat commander, you have always valued service to our country above all else. Chuck, the courage, resourcefulness, and integrity which you have displayed so magnificently throughout over 5 decades of service to the United States are the very qualities that built this country into the greatest nation on earth."
It's okay, you can cut it. You can leave it right there, actually. That's okay.
Okay, let me hand over to Brenda.
Okay. Thank you. I would like to introduce Victoria Yeager. She's General Yeager's second wife. She's from the East Coast of America. Her father was a lawyer and her mother was a social worker who's known for having convinced President Gerald Ford's wife, Betty, to go public with her alcoholism. Victoria graduated from the University of Virginia in 1980 with a drama degree, and she worked as an actress with her most recognized acting role in the film Witness with Harrison Ford. Then Victoria returned to school and received her MBA from Columbia University and later worked in investment banking. She met General Yeager in 2000 on a group hiking trip, and 3 years later they were married, and until his death in 2020 shared many adventures. Victoria is an author and public speaker who continues to promote and honor the General's memory. And for the other pilots in the audience, you'll appreciate the fact that she also flies tail draggers. So I'll present Victoria.
Thank you, Brenda. Thank you. Hi. Thank you. So if I cry, I'll just keep talking. Don't worry about it. But If General Yeager were standing up here, he'd say, it's kind of hard to see yourself age 70 years in 26 minutes. But he started out, he was born in Myra, West Virginia. There's only a white church there now. And then was raised in Hamlin, West Virginia. Some of the things I try to impress upon people is that a lot of things that happened growing up really prepared him for life. So he grew up in West Virginia and was in the woods a lot, hunted squirrel before school. He would drop the squirrel off for mom to skin and cook for dinner. He would get the brains because that's the delicacy. He'd take his gun to school, hang it in the back, and then he wouldn't do that today, I know. And then so he learned how to shoot at age 6 on up. And he also learned about dome regulators, which has to do with harnessing power, when his dad was a gas driller. Not an owner, but a gas driller, and he was well known actually for being able to solve problems. He might take a little bit longer, just like Chuck was just like his dad, but he'd only have to fix it once. One time he came back and he saw that Chuck was sitting there with a motor all in pieces. And he said, son, are you gonna be able to put that back together again? And he said, I took it apart, didn't I? And he did. He put it all back together again without any extra pieces laying around. The kids, the high school boys, were all went to the auto mechanic shop, and they learned about mechanical things and motors, and that stood him in good stead as well. He then was, at age 18, enlisted in the Army Air Corps in September of 1941. They knew that the U.S. was gearing up for war. He had actually spent age 15 and 16 in the summer at the civilian military training camps in Fort Bennington, Indianapolis, Indiana. So he was recruited. The Army Air Corps recruiter, he said, was better than the Navy recruiter. That's why he went into the Army Air Corps. But they saw that he was mechanically inclined. They made him a maintenance officer in the Air Force, in the Army Air Corps at the time. And he was 18. At the time, pilots were only 20 years old with 2 years of college, but they weren't getting enough applicants, so they lowered it to 18 in high school. And he thought, that looks like a good deal. Those pilots have gorgeous girls on their arms, clean fingernails, don't have to pull KP, I'll do that. So he applied. And after he applied, his pilot on one of the airplanes he was maintaining said, well, you've never been up in the air, let me take you up in the air. So they went up in the air and he got sick all over the airplane. And he thought, Yeager, you made a big mistake, whoops. He actually got sick the next 2 or 3 times, but mind over matter. And the worst part about it actually is he had to clean up the airplane because he was the maintenance guy. He went off to train, and actually his instructor pilots thought he'd been flying for years because he took to it so quickly. And they chose him as a fighter pilot, and let's see, he went to gunnery school, he went to various places, and in Casper, Wyoming, the last place before they were going to be shipped off to war, his engine blew up, and he had to parachute out, broke his back, and a farmer picked him up, put him on a rancher in Wyoming, put him on a horse and pulled him in. Now, if you have a broken back, riding on a horse ain't good. They said he'd never walk again. He said, oh, yeah, no, Of course, he had more stronger language than that because he wasn't going back to Hamlin, West Virginia. There wasn't anything there for him. He did recover. He did walk again, and as you all know, he got back on combat. And so he went off to New York. They went on the QE2, and as he said, there were 21 to a bet. They had 21,000 people. They'd have 7,000 sleeping, 7,000 eating, and what he said is 7,000 a puking, so going over. Anyway, they got there, and in November, he was on his first mission by January. March the 4th, he was on about his 8th or 9th mission, and he was shot. March the 4th, he was on the first U.S. raid on Berlin. Now, the weather was stinking, and everybody had been called back, but 1 box of bombers and 2 P-51s didn't get the word. So the box of bombers, actually much later, the head of the box of bombers said, and the cavalry came in. He didn't know it was Chuck Yeager and another pilot. And so they went over Berlin. They succeeded. On the way back, Chuck shot down 2 airplanes, got credit for 1, finished his ammunition, and called in and said, I'm a P-51 coming in. Don't your trigger-happy guys shoot me down. They were not too far off from some of the German planes. So he got in amongst them and got back safely. The next day, just to show he wasn't so Sierra Hotel, he, March the 5th, they were flying down to Bordeaux. He was actually a spare. One of the guys had aborted, so he came in. He was in the tail end, Charlie. And they got to Bordeaux. The weather was so bad, they couldn't even see what the targets were, so they weren't going to just throw bombs down willy-nilly. And unfortunately, the lead bomber pilot said target number 2 on the radio instead of just turning and everybody would follow. And so the Germans heard that they were up there, and they came up, and Chuck, with his 27 eyesight and also head on a swivel, called out bandits, 6 o'clock. Always check 6. And the flight leader called break, and they turned into them, and Chuck passed by 3 Me-109s. He got some hits in, they got him. They got his radiator. So he had to parachute out. I asked him much later in life, I was getting into one of the static displays and trying to get out. And I did ballet as a kid. I knew how to do that, but it was tough getting out of that. And I said, how'd you get out of this when you were shot down? He said, I didn't have to. It's falling apart in pieces all around me. Just stepped out. So he landed, he knew to stay away from cities and towns, and he landed in a forest, rode a tree sapling down, which is what he had done in West Virginia. He'd ridden the trees. And as he said, there ain't a German in the world that can catch a West Virginian in the woods. So he hid out, packed up his parachute, found a woodsman chopping wood, and he said, he mimed, neither spoke each other's language, mimed, stay here, he'd be right back. He went off, and Chuck, being smart, didn't stay right there. He moved off just in case the guy was a German spy or something, bringing back Germans. And he came, American. So he came out, and they took him to a nearby house with a barn, and that woman's husband was a POW in Germany, but about the same size. So they gave him civilian clothes. They hid him in the barn because the Germans, I promise you, we've been there several times, and there's only one German tower in the south of France and had a bird's eye view of where he came down. So the Germans were right on his heels. And they were pitchforking the haystack, and fortunately didn't quite get to him. They left there. They took him to a Russian lady's house. She ran a spa, sort of a B&B, but it was a spa. And she had escaped Russia during the revolution, gone to Paris. When the Germans were coming to Paris, she came to the south of France. And that area, the south of France, was sort of a free zone, not really, but a little bit freer than certainly Paris was. And she spoke English and Russian and all sorts of language, but they wanted to make sure he was not a German spy. So she was up in her bedroom, the second floor, and he came up there, and they said, she said, are you married? And he said, no. And he said, aha, you've got a wedding ring on. Well, he had his high school ring on his right hand. You actually saw it in the DVD if you're, I obviously have seen it plenty of times. And you all know Europeans wear their wedding ring on the right hand. And he said, no, and he explained it. Well, the Germans were down at the bottom of the stairs, coming up the stairs. She said, get under the bed. He said, I'm not sure about that, because he liked to have his own egress systems. Don't know you, lady. But she got under the covers, and he was under the bed. The Germans came up, and she started, and there wasn't penicillin in those days, 1944. So they backed out, saying, sorry, man, what are you doing? I'm sorry, and they left. So then they took this Chuck to Casteljaloux, which is actually a pretty big town, and they hid him in plain sight. They hid him in the wine cellar, which had an egress both sides. It was still open wasn't down below ground. So he was okay with that. They spent a night there. He went down to a farm, which is off the road in the woods. And actually, the 5-year-old that played soccer with him and went fishing with him, I'm going to visit in about a week and a half. He's now 84. But he would say, I didn't do anything. My parents hid him. And I said, no, you kept him occupied somewhat. Otherwise, he'd be out in the streets trying to shoot Germans or something and fight and might not be with us. So then they took him down to Nayrock, which was the big village there. And Gabriel was the head of the Maquis, and he was also the mayor. He also had the stand at the Saturday market at the head of the market. So a lot of information was exchanged there. And he stayed with Gabriel for a few days, but what happened was he got bored. And he was sitting out under the tree, and a whole bunch of Germans marched by. And Gabriel about died. When they were all past, way past, he called Chuck in and he said, "You do that again, and you and me, that's enough of that." And so Chuck was back in the shed. Gabriel was a big, he grew a lot of vegetables, big vegetable garden. That's what he sold at the Saturday market. And so there was an engine there that didn't work, and Chuck fixed it, so it was back in Gabriel's good graces. But Gabriel knew that he had this guy that didn't want to hide like all the other airmen they were hiding. So he sent him out with the Maquis up in Ambreuse, Raoul. We met Raoul. He's no longer with us, but he was a terrific guy. Raoul, and the way they travel is by bicycle, and they travel at night, sleep during the day. Well, the next night there was an airdrop, the Halifax. And what they would do is they'd line up candles, there'd be enough men, and they'd light the candles on this field for a nanosecond. And the Halifax could see that and then drop the big canisters. I think there were 2 or 3, and these guys would haul these canisters, very heavy, into the pencil factory trucks, with the pencil factory owner loaned the trucks to them. Then they take them to a place in the middle of the woods, and I got some too. That's for me, thank you. And they divvy it all up. They had fake cards, fake money, fake all sorts of things, as you can imagine. They also had plastic explosives. Now, the French didn't know how to put those together, but Chuck, drilling gas wells with his dad, knew how to do it. So he showed them how to put those together, and the different lengths of fuses, different timing, and all that, which we found out just a few years ago they used to blow up the bridges, Damazin Bridge, which was the main thoroughfare for telephone lines and for boats. And right before D-Day, they used those bombs. And so I had read this in high school, but didn't know the rest of the story. The rest of the story was Chuck Yeager helped them, and the Germans in the South never heard for 3 weeks about what was going up in the North, so they didn't provide reinforcements, which helped our guys a little. In any case, there was a sort of a détente between Gabriel and the German, who was head of the Germans in that area, because the Germans were afraid to go in the woods, they'd be ambushed, and they would. And so when the Gestapo was coming to town, that guy let Gabriel know, because one of their guys had been captured and tortured and gave up a lot of information. So Gabriel told his guys out in the woods, go hide. One guy didn't. He said, oh, they don't know about me. They never heard from him again. The Germans took him, and they never heard from him again. They staged at that guy's house. And so they had to get these airmen, there were 9 of them, all around within about 500 miles, one of them whom was Chuck, and they had to get him down to the Pyrenees and escape. Well, it was too early because the snows had not melted. 1944 was one of the worst winters in Europe. So Chuck and these other 8 guys were with a guide. We've met the guide, actually, he's no longer with us either. But anyway, so it was so bad, the weather, that those few days, that they couldn't see even almost 2 feet in front of them, so they had to hold on to the guy in front of them as they're going up 3 foot of snow, really close in trees. There was one area that they had to cross the street that the Gestapo patrolled a lot, and they each did make it across that. The guy took them around the Gestapo headquarters of the area and up into the hills, and he said, and to the border, France and Spain, and he said, Spain's that way, go as far as you can in, because the guys on the border might sell you back. Well, Chuck and this other guy got ahead of everybody else. They got ambushed in a shack. The other guy got wounded. Chuck, they threw him down, they got down a chute, and they got away from the Germans, and then Chuck carried him for the next 3 or 4 days through this thick snow, and got pretty far down, got as far as Bezos, I think, and took him down and put him on the side of the road where the Guardia Civil would get him. He went back up in the hills, went down a little farther, came down, hopped a bus, but not a bus like we see today, but maybe a truck and hanging on for dear life, got to Sort, and then turned himself into the Guardia Civil, the Spanish police, was put in jail, didn't like it, got himself out, went to a hotel and went to sleep. And the consul got him, took him to a spa, another spa, in Alhama de Aragon. And he thought to himself, what am I going to tell my kids? I spent the war at a spa watching women in bikinis. But finally, the Spaniards and the Americans were negotiating how much petroleum, because Spain didn't have petroleum products. Chuck always wondered how many gallons he was worth. But anyway, they got him down to Gibraltar, back up to England. And they wanted to send him home, because what if he were shot down again and were tortured? He might give up everybody. And he kept saying, no, I'm not going home. Nope. So they, Lieutenant Colonel, who's your boss? Colonel, who's your boss? General, who's your boss? Finally, General Eisenhower has Chuck and this other guy in his office, and he said, I don't normally see guys like you. Why don't you want to go home? What's the matter with you? And he said, I haven't done my job. You've spent all this time training me. I want to go fight some Germans. So General Eisenhower knew that D-Day was coming. Wasn't going to tell Chuck this, of course, or at the time he was a flight officer. So he sent him back to his base. He said, don't get on combat. This is a decision higher up than me, and I'll let you know, but you do not get on combat till I send the orders. So he goes out there, and around July, mid-July, he's up training the new guys. And his commanding officer called up and said, are your guns hot? And he said, yep. So he said, go out to the North Sea. There's a bunch of bomber crew in a dinghy, and they need top cover till they can be rescued. So they go out there and they're flying top cover, and Chuck sees a Ju-88 coming out from Helgoland on the east side of the North Sea. So he chases them back and shoots them down right over Helgoland. And the bomber crew's rescued. They get back, and he tells his CO, I shot down a Ju-88. And the commanding officer said, Yeager, can't you do anything right? You're not supposed to be on combat. It's like, you sent me over there. So he gets back on combat, and as you saw on there, October 12th, he's allowed back on combat about September, shoots down an airplane. On October 12th, he shoots down 5, and the Stars and Stripes says, flyer vindicates Ike's ruling. Then I'll just tell you some of the letters between him and Glennis. He had met Glennis in Oroville during his training, his first wife. They were so beautiful. And he'd write back and say, I shot down 5 airplanes. I think I'm going to get a medal. She'd write back and say, I had meatloaf for dinner tonight. 2 different worlds. Then she got a little bit more suggestive. What house would you like to live after you get married to someone? Me, hopefully. But anyway, so it was pretty fun to see those letters. Then he came back, and you saw a lot of this talks about the X-1, but what happened was, as an evadee, he got to choose where he would be stationed next, and he chose Wright Pat because it was close to home. So, and that was perfect for the rest of us and for him, because that's where it was done. So, anyway, there's a lot more to it, but I'll just open it to Q&A and see if any questions we can focus on what you want to talk about. Yes?
Please, I will bring the microphone.
It's being live streamed, so we want the audience to hear that too.
Yeah, on the video, there's a mention of a Chuck Yeager Foundation.
Yes, the General Chuck Yeager, we've dissolved that, and now it's the General Chuck Yeager Legacy Foundation. And right now we're working on a few things. We're working on, the purpose is to keep his legacy alive. And I mean, he's still an inspiration to people today. So we're doing a documentary, and hopefully it'll be a series of documentaries. The first one is 0 through World War II. That might have to split into 2. There's so much there. And then we're also trying to get a United States postal stamp or sheet of stamps, because he lived to almost 98, so he went through a lot of aviation eras. So it'd be cool to have all these airplanes and Chuck. Anyway, I think so. Enough other people think so as well. Those are the 2 that come to mind right away. But none of the money goes to salaries or anything like that. We don't. I don't want to manage money. Thank you. Yes. I guess I can do that. Thank you.
Thank you. I have three partial questions, if I may. What does it mean that Chuck was credited with shooting down 1.5 enemy planes?
That means 2 people shot at it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Secondly, in the when he first surpassed the 1 Mach limit, was a sonic boom heard on the Earth, or?
Yes.
Because it's not clear in the movie whether there was a.
Yes, they heard it
clear
down
sound,
below.
yeah.
Well, right after he broke the sound barrier, he said, "This Mach meter's all screwy. It doesn't make any sense." And that was sort of, it was a really top secret event. The Germans, the English, everybody else didn't know for at least 5 or 6 years. In fact, the MiG-15 did not have supersonic capabilities in 1953. So, but that was code to Jack Ridley on the ground that they had exceeded Mach 1. And then they heard the boom.
Right. And nowadays, is there an upper limit to the supersonic speed? Or do people think that there is a limit, that at one point the plane would become uncontrollable?
Not uncontrollable, but what happened, the fastest man alive on Earth, because in space they go 25 Mach or even more, but on Earth, the fastest anybody ever went was Pete Knight in about 67, 68 maybe. Pete Knight was a test pilot with Chuck, lovely guy. He went 6.7, but when he landed, his plane was on fire. So it has to do with materials more than other capabilities. Chuck has gone over Mach 3. He did go in the SR-71. And he's also flown over 361 different makes and models of airplanes around the world. Don't think that'll be repeated. And that wasn't his last flight in 97 at Edwards. What happened in 2000, he went down to get his flight physical, and the general in charge at Edwards called him into his office, and he said, "I want you to open the air show for me this fall, October 14th. And General Yeager said, "General, I've retired." And this 2-star looked at him and said, "You're not listening." Yes, sir, yes, sir. So he actually flew, his last military flight was 2012, and he continued to fly really into just before he died. He actually got kind of, oddly, after 74 years, he said, "Nah, I'm good." So he'd be flying the right seat, or he'd be in the right seat, and they'd say, "General, would you like the control?" He said, No, I'm good." So, thank you. Anybody else have a question?
You used the phrase, sorry. Did he have any favorite aircraft?
Did he have it?
Were there any that he hated?
Did he have any favorite aircraft? Well, what he would say to you is it depends on the mission. But I think his 3 favorite generally were the X-1, the P-51, and the F-15E. That's what he would take to fight a war today, or 2 years ago. And a lot of people like the F-15E. Thank you. Oh, and the airplanes that he didn't like.
MiG-15?
What?
Apart from the MiG-15?
Oh, right. The airplane he didn't like was, wait a minute, there was one. Oh, he's not big on the, can't think of the name of it now. It's a civilian plane. A lot of pilots a lot of military pilots in the 30s, 40s trained on it. And it'll come to me. It's a tail dragger. I've flown in it a lot. It's an open cockpit, and it's really hard to see when you land, and it's just not that fun. It's unwieldy. I'll think of the name of it in a minute. Stearman. Yeah. Yes. Thank you.
Sorry, you used an expression I didn't. You said as a returning MD, or what was the?
Evadee.
Sorry.
Evadee. Evadee. Someone who's evaded the Germans. He wasn't captured, but he evaded them.
Okay.
Anyone else? Hold on just a sec. We have to get the microphone for you. Or you can probably talk into mine. I'll get close.
Thank you.
But people will talk.
Maybe I would like to add that there was a regulation in place that evadees and former POWs were barred from combat flying on the same theater.
Although he did fly in the same theater.
But it was an exception, as you mentioned.
Yeah, yeah.
I was a bit surprised that General Yeager flew combat missions in Vietnam. I wonder, did he have any qualms about the political implications of the Vietnam War?
He did not get involved in that at all. He would say, "Quit talking politics. You're giving me indigestion." But he was there early on, and no, he flew 127 missions. One of the most interesting stories on that is that there was a guy at a hunting convention that said, he came out and he said, I want to give you a gun. And Chuck looked at the prices, $6,000, $10,000. He said, yeah, no, I can't afford that. He said, no, I want to give you a gun. You saved our lives. You saved all my men. And what happened was they were all pinned down from this mountain, and the North Vietnamese were shooting out of these caves, so it was hard to get to them. So Chuck was leading the group, and he dropped a bomb and nothing. And usually he did pretty well with that bomb dropping. I mean, so nanoseconds later, which seems like eons, the whole mountain blew up. It had gone into the tunnel right into the middle, and kaboom, the whole mountain. And those guys were saved. And this guy, Kenny Jarrett, was one of them. Thank goodness, because Jarrett guns are great. So we fed a lot of people shooting elk with that gun. Any other? I can tell you, too, one of the things about World War II, they found that 11% of the guys shot down about 90% of the enemy aircraft. And what did they have in common? Well, they all grew up hunting as kids with a gun in their hand. They also stayed alive. Yeah. Any other questions? What's a tail dragger is the question. A tail dragger, so there's different kinds of airplanes. You have the main gear, and then you have a nose gear, or the tail gear. So the planes aim like that, have a tail wheel, and that's what a tail dragger is. Tail draggers are much harder once you get about 10 feet off the ground. They're harder to land and harder to take off. Well, not so hard to take off. Well, harder to land for sure. Because what happens is they can easily just suddenly go take a turn on the ground, and you don't want to do that. Any other questions? Yeah. The magic mic. Could you pass that down to him, please? Thank you.
My question is really off-field. You mentioned, or it came across, that one of his great facilities was being able to remember everything he was doing to get the focus, the singular focus on what he was doing, which was so useful when he's actually recording all these various changes. Did he have that if he had an ordinary life as such, did he have that in ordinary life as well? Was he able to put a similar focus into normal everyday things?
Oh, yes. In fact, when I first, when you meet somebody and you're with somebody, it's sort of a learning curve. And so I met him in March 25th, and then by September, he was flying a P-51, and he hadn't flown it in about 6 months. Before I tell you that part, what was most interesting about him is that he could have flown a P-51 on a Tuesday. The very next day, he's getting into a different P-51, same configuration, same everything. He still would ask the crew chief, check me out on this. Because every plane has its own idiosyncrasies, no matter what. So that, and a lot of pilots will get in, I've flown this, and take off. But no, he wouldn't. You tell me what I need to know. But anyway, so in September, or just before that, he had said, don't talk to me about anything but what I'm about to do for at least an hour before I'm going to go fly. Don't try to take my focus away. And when the first time we flew together, so we met on, it wasn't actually a group, it was just I was on my own and he was on his own, but the next day we went hiking together, then we went flying. So we go flying in a tail dragger, and he's doing a pre-flight. He's checking the airplane. And one of the things he did was he waggled the wing. Well, I was on the other side. I just thought he was flirting with me. He was just seeing if the wings would fall off. And then we're in the plane, and it's front to back in this tail dragger, and there's controls in the back, so there's a stick. And so he does this, and it kind of hits my knees or whatever, and I'm thinking he's flirting with me. No, he was checking to make sure that everything moved as it should, and there's nothing in between. I was just hopeful, Yes.
Actually, what I was trying to get at was whether in normal life, outside of flying completely, did he have a similar focus in anything else he was doing in life that wasn't connected with flying?
Yes. He was very mechanically inclined, as we said. He built a bridge across our creek so that our ATV could get across. He did road brakes, but he would think about all those things and be really focused on that. So yes, he absolutely did. He thought things through. It's coming. Microphone is coming. Here.
In those cases when he got into trouble at high speed and high altitude, did the subsequent investigations always reveal the reason for those mishaps?
Yes.
And secondly, as a result of this, is aerodynamics today a much more exact science than it was in his time?
It certainly keeps progressing, yeah, but there's a limit so far. I mean, so in the NF-104, when he had that, you saw in one of the things, what happened was okay, I'll start again. What happened was he went up at too steep a flight altitude. And so he went up too steep, and the motors up there that would make your nose come down so you can come back in nose first, they failed. So he came back in tail first. And then he started spinning. He kept trying to get it out, but every time it went down, the parachute came out and slowed it down, so he couldn't quite get it. His chase pilot was telling punch out, punch out, punch out. He knew if he got below 6,000 feet, so from 114,000 down to 6,000, didn't take very long to get down there, but he knew he had to wait. And he'd have a much, much, much higher chance of surviving if you jump out lower than 6,000 feet. The other thing he always did is he would always think, how can I bust my butt? How can I prevent it? But part of that was knowing his egress systems better than the manufacturers. So when he punched out, the plane was going down at 100 miles an hour. He punched out, it was 100 miles an hour, so he was suspended. His rocket seat flew up, hit the shroud lines and burned them, came down, hit his face mask and burned him. He knew if he got that face mask up, the visor up, it would stop the flow of oxygen. He could put out the fire, which he did, still burned the left side of his face. And he was gulping in air, and so, I guess with his left hand, so it burned the tips, very, very tips of his ring finger and little finger. And so, and he got down and obviously survived, but if you see the shroud lines, there's a picture of the shroud lines, there were just a hair left in them. And he got that helmet off, which usually takes 3 people apparently, but he get that thing off of me. A guy came up and was going to try to help him, just was horrified. Fortunately, they got there very quickly. And he was, they had to scrape his face every 3 days, which was very painful. You've seen burns where it doesn't look so pretty afterwards. But he had a facial, but it was very, very painful for 30 days. And then, as you saw, he got back on combat. So, yeah, we were out there filming, and where the plane came down, and the pictures of the plane, it's about as big as that glass. I'm exaggerating, but it was very small after the crash, and frankly, he had a tear in his eye. And some people they had gotten some of the pieces, and they wanted to sell them and all that, and he said, that was destruction. That was terrible. No, so we didn't condone that at all. But it's interesting to see the different sides of General Yeager as I lived with him. Gave my exercise. I'm teasing.
The F-104 was a particularly nasty aircraft. The German Luftwaffe called it the Widowmaker. It had a nasty habit of flaming out and dropping like a stone. Was this something that Yeager was trying to investigate, or was this known at the time?
What he said about all that is that they were just flying beyond the envelope. And when you heard about the envelope being the capability of the aircraft. And what When I don't know if you all read about this, but there was a time, maybe within the last 20 years anyway, that there were a lot of F-15s that were flaming out, or just. And what was happening was it was mostly Air National Guard, and they were showing off flying at 9 Gs of some of these passengers, like Meteor or something like that. And the airplane was really only stressed to fly 9 Gs for 3 hours for its lifetime. You're not supposed to go 9 Gs. And you're never going to be in a dogfight. If you're in a dogfight, it's too late. Somebody from the periphery is going to blow you from, blow you apart from way out where you can't even see.
May I have a few technical points?
Sure.
Since you mentioned the Starfighter, the fateful flight when General Yeager had to eject, as Victoria mentioned, an engine failed. It wasn't the main engine of the aircraft, but it was so-called reaction control system. Because he was so high, where the atmosphere is so thin, you cannot control your aircraft by means of aerodynamic forces, because there is basically no atmosphere. So his Starfighter was equipped with a set of rocket engines in the front and on the wingtips and so on. And Yep, exactly like that. And his reaction control system failed. Also, as you said, that Starfighter claimed many lives of Luftwaffe pilots. The trouble was that Starfighter wasn't an aircraft designed for the role Germans used it. Starfighter was an interceptor. So basically, in the 60s, the only viable means to deliver atomic bomb was via a conventional bomber. So you wanted to intercept those bombers. You weren't aiming for maneuverability, you weren't aiming for endurance, you were aiming for horizontal speed and climb speed. And this is the area in which Starfighter excelled, but the Germans used it in the fighter-bomber role. They flew it very close to the ground and in very bad weather. So basically, and they were also less disciplined than their American counterparts. So basically, those were the reasons why there were so many fatalities on the Starfighter, or as Germans call it, their Witwenmacher or Erdnagel. It's like tent peg. Okay, then as Victoria mentioned, the case when General Yeager was shot down. Basically, P-51 Mustang wasn't renowned for durability. This aircraft wasn't so sturdy like, for example, P-47 Thunderbolt. And I heard a story of...
Hold on, you're getting into trouble here. General Yeager would disagree with you.
Oh, well, I heard a story of another American pilot who unfortunately became a POW because he was recovering from a dive in P-51, and basically he fell down through the floor of his cockpit. His P-51 disintegrated. But
that might be a story, or it might be that they shot the area out.
P-47 was much sturdier airframe than
you can't say that at General Chuck Yeager talk. You can only say that elsewhere.
And last thing about the makes, as you mentioned, it was a nasty aircraft to recover from a spin. In fact, there was a vertical line painted on the instrument panel on the MiG-15 and also on the later variants like 17, 19 and so on. And you were supposed to align your control stick very carefully with that white line, because it was the only position in which you were somewhat guaranteed to recover from the spin. Okay, and that's all from me. Don't let me.
Actually, what happened was the reason the P-51 General Yeager liked it so much is that the Spitfires were good, but they could only go for about an hour. The P-51 could go for at least probably about 8 hours. So they could go all the way to Poland and back and all the way to Germany and back. So that's what made it a lot better for the... And the other part I was going to tell you I forgot is that General Yeager was a flight officer, and he was leading the group when Jimmy Doolittle Tokyo Raid, came out, and he said, what's that kid doing flying a lead? He's a flight officer. Well, and so he went on his mission, and when he came back, Jimmy Doolittle called him in, and he said, what's the story on you? And he said, Chuck had gotten court-martialed in Tonopah when they were learning gunnery. And how he got court-martialed is he was doing night duty, and a guy came by and wanted to see how the gun worked. And it's a desert. So he shoots it out in the desert, but oh dear, there was a wild horse. And some rancher claimed it as his. So he got court-martialed. But because there's no internet in 1943, it never caught up with him. And so he was in England, and fortunately it was during a war. So Jimmy Doolittle just wiped that out, and he became first lieutenant. I think he skipped second lieutenant and went straight on to captain. So a lot of times these really great guys actually get kind of passed over because Chuck was never looking to get the next rank. He was looking to do a great job. And he was always looking to see what next job he could do. For instance, after the war, Pakistan and India, which the U.S. was backing Pakistan, he went to the fellows at the Pentagon, and he asked them if he could have the director of safety job. So he's always looking for the next job where he could keep flying, is what it mostly was. He would have gotten a second star if he was willing to go to the Pentagon, and that's why he retired in '75. But the other thing about him being director of safety was great for all of us and great for civilians because he changed the protocol. When he got there, it was primary cause, secondary causes. So they'd fix the primary cause and not fix the secondary causes. And that's what happened with Columbia and the Challenger. They fixed the primary, not the secondary. And so he changed it to an all-cause accident. So they'd fix everything. And that spilled into the civilian world, saving tens of millions of people's lives. And NASA would never take advice from the Air Force until they had a couple of disasters. Now they're doing a little better. For the last one, there were 36 problems. They fixed 34. 35 and 36 were the tiles. So it's really sad. And I'll tell you what, that made Chuck ferociously angry because they could have prevented, easily preventable. Yeah. Okay.
I have one General Yeager question, one Victoria Scott Yeager question, if I may, if this is not only a General Yeager talk. The first one is, I think I have spotted in the film among the astronaut pupils of General Yeager, Mike Collins. Is it possible?
Yes.
In the second row.
Yes.
And secondly, about your role in Witness, were you one of the Amish women?
No, I was in the precinct. I'm in there, and I offer him a little cookie, so he comes over and then wanders around and sees the picture of the bad guy. They had a deal with the union, and I got in on that deal. So, any other questions? Any other? So I've written a book. I'll just do a little advertising here. 101 Chuck Yeagerisms. It's a lie. There's 131. And one of them is, I'll tell you that story. One of them is the first time I saw a jet, I shot it down. It's during a war. It was okay. The Germans had come out towards the end of the war with the Me-262, which just, if you went to chase them, they just took off. But they didn't have longevity. And so Chuck, the first time, he saw one on final. So it had its gear down. It was going slowly. And he said, unsportsmanlike, but what the hell? And he knew not to get right behind it because the first plane he shot down, the pieces were coming at him. So he knew to get to the side of it, shot it down, and his only egress was to go down the runway. And the Germans on one side were shooting, but it was going over his canopy, fortunately, and they're shooting themselves. And he took off and then really took off. And they said, why don't you do a second pass? He said, never make a second pass. That's when they know you're coming. And so that's why the bomber in the back really has it rough. So anyway, there's some of these stories are in here. It's actually mostly a lot of pictures. And there's a lot of his sayings, which are great. One of them was with Neil Armstrong. So Neil Armstrong wanted him to come with him to look at the dry lake beds in Nevada and California. And Chuck knew them like the back of his hand, and he wanted to go to Smith's Dry Lake, and he said, it's not dry. It's wet. And so he said, no, I'm not going. And so the head of NASA said, would you please go as a favor to me? And he said, yeah, but I'm not going to be responsible. I'm not. So Chuck was in the back seat, Neil Armstrong was in the front seat. And they went up to Smith's Dry Lake, and they looked down, and sure enough, it was wet. And Neil said, I'm just going to do a touch and go. And a touch and go is you touch down and you take off. You don't stop. And so Chuck said, you may touch, but you ain't going to go. And sure enough, they got down, they touched, and they got stuck in the mud. There's a picture of that. They're kind of rare of the two of them. And so fortunately, the head of NASA, Paul, trusted Chuck's opinion. Actually, what happened, Chuck looked at Neil and said, they're in their summer suits, and it's going to get pretty cold. It's the desert. And he said, what are you going to do now, Neil? But anyway, fortunately, Paul knew, and so he sent a Goonie bird, which is a tail dragger, and they called in on the radio, and Chuck said, just land on the side of the lake, just right on the edge. Do not stop. Just keep going. We'll run, and you can pull us in. And that's what happened. They went back. It took them 5 days to go back and for it to dry and take that airplane. So, and then it's funny because the first time I met Neil was at the National Air and Space Museum, and they'd had their board meeting. We were up there because Chuck was giving a talk that night, and Chuck, we went in, as they were finished, we went in, and we're swimming upstream, and Neil is backing up because Chuck's coming at him. It was pretty funny, but they were good friends, and I have a picture of them in a helicopter together. They're not flying, they're in the back seat, and I'm in the back seat as well, kind of laughing, and it was fun. There's a few stories like that in there. I'm writing another book. It's with the editor now. It's about our lives together because it was always fun with Chuck. There were lots of adventures, so that should come out in 6 months, or 2 years, if we're lucky, right? So I have these books for sale if you want them, and then I have Yeager, an autobiography. A lot of people have read The Right Stuff, but his autobiography is from his oral history, and so he was a great storyteller. Anyway, any more questions? Yeah.
Where's the X1 now?
The X1, actually, glad you asked. It used to be on the mall at the National Air and Space Museum hanging. They were going to put it in storage because they were storing and renovating that facility. And they were going to put it in storage for last year, which was the 75th anniversary. And I wrote to them, I said, no, you're not. That's not happening. And so I wrote enough times that they decided it was so interesting. In the middle of the night, it looked like a mummy. And they took it from the mall down to Udvar-Hazy, which is right by Dulles Airport, and they have a lot of room there. So now it's on the ground. So if you do want to see it and you're going to the States, it's a perfect time to see it because you can get very close. Otherwise, it's hanging up in the atrium. Chuck saw it on the ground in 2015 because they had to do maintenance. So, any other questions? Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. Thank you.